Open our hearts, free every soul. The fear inside, you must let it go. Oh, that monster, before it conquers you. Yeah, we all have demons, we fight every day. You get knocked down, but the bell hasn't rang, so keep going. Just stay focused when life seems hopeless. Before life passes you by, you must, like a bird with broken wings always. You've gotta reach for the stars. It might seem far. Ooh, don't stop. You gotta try. Oh, 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 you gotta try. Never stop dreaming, even away. Nothing can stop you from winning this race, so keep going. Just stay focused. Yeah, I am the tiger, I own the prize. Every storm is with the rainbow in the sky. You are golden. If no one else noticed, don't stop, keep going. Before life passes you by, you must, like a bird with broken wings always. You gotta reach for the stars. It might seem far. Ooh, don't stop. You gotta try. Oh, 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 you gotta try. You gotta try. All you got to do is try. Oh, you gotta 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 try. You gotta try. All you got to do is try. You gotta try.
I think the biggest piece of advice
You've been hearing about the deadly effects of fentanyl and how some people are getting their hands on it without even realizing it.
But why now? And what is fentanyl exactly? What makes this drug different? In this case, that explains. We head to the DEA lab in Dallas, where pills laced with fentanyl are coming in by the thousands.
Pharmaceutical fentanyl is a Schedule II drug that is typically used in hospitals to treat pain.
It's mostly used as a medication to really rapidly deliver pain relief to someone while they're in the operating room. It's usually given as like an infusion.
It can come in patch form.
It is one of the fastest acting opioids that we know. It acts within like 1 to 2 minutes.
There is no pill form.
We told you about a mother who feared her 17-year-old daughter died of a fentanyl overdose. The medical examiner's toxicology report confirmed that news.
Federal officials are sounding the alarm over an increasing number of fake prescription pills that contain potentially deadly fentanyl.
All of the federal drug evidence that comes from Texas, Oklahoma, or New Mexico comes into this DEA laboratory. We're looking to see what the sample contains, so whether it's methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, or fentanyl.
The fentanyl that we're seizing, it's coming from Mexico. It's being smuggled into our communities by these Mexican drug cartels. They're making it look legitimate in a manner to appear to be Oxycontin, Percocet, Adderall, and other prescribed drugs. drug traffickers that work in these clandestine labs that are making these fake pills. They are unaware of how much fentanyl they're putting into these pills.
Right now we're seeing the majority of the pills, but we also see it in powder form as well as compressed powder.
Is there any way for anyone to tell just by looking at a pill or a powder whether it contains fentanyl?
No. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
This seizure came into the lab while we were here today. An estimated 30,000 pills out of the El Paso area ready to be tested. This amount, what's in this vial, is 2 milligrams. That is a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl.
The same test that we use for fentanyl, we use on other drugs too that we test. This is a typical fentanyl case that we got. This is a 1 kilogram of M30 tablets. They're made to look like oxycodone tablets. You can see that there's an M printed on one side and a 30 on the other side.
Take a look at the pictures. Can you tell the difference between the fake pill and the real pill? No, you cannot. This is a fake pill. And that's the problem.
And they're typically about 2 milligrams of fentanyl in the tablets. And 2 milligrams is a really small amount. For instance, this is 2 milligrams of fentanyl in there.
Oh wow, you can barely see there's anything even in there.
Correct. So that amount of fentanyl is in each one of those tablets. One of the tests we do is a quick rapid test called the immunoassay. And it looks for the specific fentanyl metabolites that are found in human urine. So we only need a little bit of the sample to do that. Just take a few milligrams of it, put it in test tube, and then we mix it with water. So these are the immunoassay tests. They're kind of like pregnancy tests. You're looking for the specific antigen, fentanyl antigen in that. The water is traveling up the sample stick. Once the metabolites interact with the antigens, you'll see a line. If we see one line on the C, that means it's positive.
So you said this is not unlike a pregnancy test?
Right,
It looks similar to an at-home COVID test.
Exactly. So we have to use our instruments to positively identify it, but this is just a rapid test to determine if those tablets might contain fentanyl. And there we go. So our sample matches that of the positive control. So we know that that tablet probably has fentanyl in it.
It appears as though it could be candy. And the drug dealers are utilizing rainbow fentanyl to reach our kids. It's more of an attraction.
Therapeutically, it's 100 to 200 times more potent than morphine. We are seeing already like many overdoses happening in high schools. There is less time, I would say, to save them than if they were to overdose on any other opioid. But that still doesn't mean that you can't save them. Is 100% going to work if you have it. But if you don't have it, then it's going to be too late.
You're putting your life at risk by taking a pill that has not been prescribed to you. One pill can kill.
Now you can find out how to get free Narcan by visiting morenarcanplease.com. You can also find that link within this story on our website at ksat.com.
Keep up to date with all of San Antonio's top news, weather, and so much more by clicking the like and subscribe buttons below. And once again, thanks for watching KSAT.
Somewhere around 70,000 or so people die each and every year from an opioid-related overdose. Back in the early 2000s, the culprit was oxycodone, an opioid that most would probably recognize under the name of OxyContin. But in 2013 or so, it was fentanyl that overtook both OxyContin and heroin on the center stage in the opioid epidemic. As for who's to blame, well, it's a combination of things. You have pharmaceutical greed and malpractice, you have healthcare providers that are over and misprescribing their patients, and then you have a flood of illicitly produced fentanyl coming from China, Mexico, and India, all of those factors were working together to create the current fentanyl crisis. These days, fentanyl is being disguised as legitimate medications and then being smuggled into the United States and many other countries. Some may think they're getting Xanax or Adderall, but instead are getting a high dose of fentanyl, considering fentanyl is around 50 times more powerful than heroin and 100 times more powerful than morphine, and oftentimes only 2 milligrams of fentanyl is enough to deliver a fatal dose. Dependence and accidental overdoses are skyrocketing. In today's video, we're going to discuss the legitimate uses for fentanyl and what happens to the body when it's consumed. We'll see why withdrawals are so brutally difficult to overcome and why overdosing is such an easy thing to do. It's going to be an important one. Let's do this. Before we start today's video, if you or someone you know is struggling with opioid dependency or opioid use disorder and you're looking for help, we've added some resources to the description of this video that we strongly encourage you to check out. Let's first discuss the difference between an opiate and an opioid, because there is an actual difference between the two. Opiates are natural compounds that come from poppy sap and poppy plant fibers. So this would include morphine and codeine, for example. While opioids, that's more of an umbrella term, and it's encompassing any compound that is going to bind to and have an action on opioid receptors in the body. So that would include the natural opiates like morphine and codeine, but also semi-synthetic opioids. So that would include like heroin, and then fully synthetic, which would be fentanyl, for example. Now you may be wondering why the body has opioid receptors in the first place. Well, it comes down to the fact that your body makes its own opioids to bind to those receptors. They're called endogenous opioids, and I guarantee you've heard of one of them, endorphins. Endorphin stands for endogenous morphine, but it's only one example of these opioids. You also have what are called enkephalins, dynorphins, endomorphins, nociceptin, or also called orphanin. Now, they'll bind to those receptors, and they have a whole wide variety of effects that we're going to discuss in a moment. Just understand that exogenous opioids, or coming from an external source, so this is going to be like heroin, morphine, or fentanyl, will bind to those receptors, right? So they're taking advantage of something that's already there, and then what they do is they cause an exaggerated response. Now, to best understand how opioids work and why your body even bothers making endogenous opioids, we first need to understand how pain works and is processed. Now, we've already done an entire video on this, so we'll go ahead and link that up above. If you want a more robust understanding, I strongly encourage you to check out that video. But in a nutshell, let's say I jam my pinky finger, right? So I hit it, and that's gonna send, obviously, a painful signal up a sensory neuron, and that neuron's gonna travel from my pinky, through my arm, and up towards my spinal cord. But when it gets into the spinal cord, this is where it's going to synapse or communicate with a secondary neuron. So this first neuron we call the presynaptic neuron. Then the one that it synapses with or communicates with in the spinal cord is the postsynaptic neuron. And what will happen is this postsynaptic neuron will now take the signal up the spinal cord. Let me go ahead and grab this brain here. And it's going to take it to the brain. So you're looking at the right hemisphere of the brain as seen from the sagittal or midline view. Now, grab my probe. So what's going to happen is the signal is going to travel up the brainstem, and it's going to go to this area here called the thalamus. The thalamus is, you can think of it as like a hub, right? It's going to direct signals to where they need to go. So what will happen is the thalamus will send the signal into this region here, which is called the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is where you are going to be made aware of the fact that you have a problem. Now, some data does suggest that the thalamus has some awareness, but if it does, this is still going to be where the majority of your awareness is going to be. But it's also going to send a signal to a structure that's deeper down in here that we can't see, called the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for processing negative emotions, so this is what makes you not very happy about the fact that you just jammed your finger, right? So that's what we call the ascending pain pathway. But the brain, or the body I should say, also has a descending pain pathway. Because think about it. After you've jammed your finger, you don't need to have that same pain level as long as the stimulus is gone, right? The painful, that noxious stimulus is gone. So what will happen is your body wants to start numbing the pain with those endogenous opioids. So again, grab the brain here. The thalamus will send a signal, and it'll go down into this area here. This is called the midbrain of the brainstem. And in the midbrain is what is called gray matter. Gray matter is just a location where cells are synapsing with each other. But this gray matter is called the periaqueductal gray. And you're not really going to be able to see that all that much in this section here. But from there, a signal is going to be sent down the brainstem, down the spinal cord, and go to that location in the substantia gelatinosa where those two neurons were communicating with one another. And it's at this site that the endogenous opioids will be secreted. And it does this to modulate the pain. And I say modulate on purpose. It's not like it's getting rid of the pain, right? Just if you jam your finger and then wait 2 minutes, it's not as though the pain is just completely gone. There's still going to be pain there. And depending on how bad you jammed your finger, the pain could be much worse. So this is where the opioids will bind to receptors that we're about to discuss and changes your perception of the pain, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, without getting too far into the weeds when it comes to how this synapse and signal modulation works, what's being communicated between the pre and the postsynaptic neuron are neurotransmitters. Now, there's a lot of different types of neurotransmitters out there, but the ones that are going to be interesting or important to us are going to be glutamate and GABA. More so GABA than glutamate. Just think about it like this. A signal, when it's being sent between neurons, can either be excitatory or inhibitory. If it's excitatory, it's just saying, let's keep this signal going. If it's inhibitory, it's saying, let's stop this signal. So, if glutamate is released at the synapse, that's an excitatory signal. But if GABA is released, that's an inhibitory signal. So I want you to think about this for a second. If you were able to prevent glutamate from being released, that would also inhibit the signal. Or if you were to prevent GABA from being released, that would also excite the signal, right? And continue the signal on. And this is where opioids are going to do their thing. Now, the way that opioids are able to have an effect or modulate the signal at the synapse is through those opioid receptors. Now, depending on where you look, you may see as many as 5 different types of opioid receptors, and each of those have their own subtypes. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus on 3 of them, and that's going to be the mu receptor, the delta receptor, and the kappa receptor. Although we're primarily going to be focusing on the mu receptor because that is the most well studied, and it also happens to be the receptor that fentanyl prefers. Although fentanyl will definitely choose all 3 of them, but again, it prefers that mu receptor. Now, you're going to find the mu receptor and these other receptors throughout the entire body, but they're going to be in different densities. So with the mu receptor, you're going to find a lot of them in the digestive system, which actually makes a ton of sense if you understand that opioid usage comes with some pretty intense constipation and peristalsis type of issues. But when it comes to the nervous system, you're also going to find mu receptors in the substantia gelatinosa, right? That spinal cord where those 2 neurons are communicating. Again, makes a ton of sense. When it comes to the brain, I'm going to grab this hemisphere again. You're going to find mu receptors in the brainstem, which is one reason that you're going to have issues with breathing. And we're going to see that when we get to overdosing here in a moment. But you're also going to find mu receptors in the thalamus as well as the cerebral cortex. But the mu receptors that are in the cerebral cortex are primarily going to be associated with pain processing, which makes perfect sense because one of the reasons, or actually the main reason you take an opioid, is for analgesia. But you're also going to find mu receptors in another pathway, and that is going to be what's called the mesolimbic pathway. And the mesolimbic pathway is right here, actually. So there's an area here in the midbrain of the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area. And the ventral tegmental area is actually going to be communicating with another area right about here. Again, it's going to be deep, called the nucleus accumbens. And what will happen is it will actually be secreting GABA to the nucleus accumbens, among other areas. And if you recall me saying GABA is inhibitory. So when GABA is being secreted, it's telling the other neuron to not secrete what it's going to secrete. Well, in this case, the nucleus accumbens secretes dopamine. So right now, right, unless you're doing something very pleasurable and joyful, you're probably not secreting dopamine. But let's say you enjoy some chocolate, right? We all know chocolate's amazing. So if you were to consume some chocolate, what's going to happen is the ventral tegmental area will say, we can enjoy this moment, and it's going to stop secreting GABA, which will then allow the neurons here to start secreting dopamine. Well, opioids are going to do the same thing. What's going to happen is they are going to bind to mu receptors in the ventral tegmental area, which will then stop GABA secretion, which will then cause dopamine release and flooding into the nervous system. And this is the basis of addiction, right? Because it feels amazing. And this is what you'll see pretty much anyone who consumes opioids and when they're beginning to consume opioids, is that it feels fantastic. The problem is that you're gonna have to start taking more and more of the substance, whatever it is. And again, it's not just opioids that do this, right? There's a vast array of substances that will affect this mesolimbic or this reward pathway. But when you start getting tons and tons of dopamine surges, you're gonna have to start taking more and more to get the same dopamine surges. And that is the basis of addiction, at least in terms of pleasure, joy, and eventually just outright need. Now, you may be wondering why fentanyl is even available given how extremely powerful it is. If you recall me saying earlier, it's around 100 times more powerful than morphine. Although I have seen some texts suggest that it could be as high as 400 times as powerful. Although they weren't perfectly clear if that was fentanyl or derivatives of fentanyl, because as depressing as this is, there are even more powerful synthetic opioids than fentanyl out there, and they are on the street just as fentanyl is. But you have to understand that fentanyl is supposed to be administered under very specific circumstances. And so think extreme pain. Maybe someone has been taking morphine, a lot of morphine for their pain. Eventually, they become tolerant to it. They need something stronger. Maybe they have cancer pain, right? Because cancer can be extraordinarily painful. Fentanyl has some great usage for that. You'll also see fentanyl be administered by anesthesiologists. Maybe someone's going under the knife, or maybe they're having an epidural for some reason. So there are plenty of use cases for fentanyl, and they have been used in very good ways, right? In very controlled and proper ways. But it's just not meant to be where it is today, and you can see why that is such a problem because of that, right? It's so easy to overdose on fentanyl, extremely easy to overdose. If you recall me saying, opioids can actually have an effect on the respiration centers of the body, so in the brainstem, but also into an area called the hypothalamus. So you have to understand that right now, as you're breathing, your body is, monitoring everything, right? You have respiratory rhythms going to your diaphragm, coming from the brainstem, saying breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, right? Your brain is monitoring how much carbon dioxide is actually in your bloodstream. And so then when carbon dioxide starts to increase, it'll actually reflexively cause you to inhale oxygen or exhale the carbon dioxide and inhale oxygen. But if you're overdosing on an opioid, that can get so saturated by the opioids themselves that you can't overcome that. And so what will happen is you will actually die from respiratory depression, right? You literally cannot breathe because the opioids have completely saturated those areas, right? The opioid receptors on those areas. And the only way out of that is with another opioid called naloxone. Also, sometimes people will call it Narcan. That's a brand of it. So what they'll do is by administering Narcan or naloxone, what will happen is those will actually bind to those same receptors and prevent fentanyl, morphine, or any of the other opioids from getting there. And it will actually, so then what will happen is the person will come out of it. They'll be able to breathe again, and typically they'll go immediately into withdrawals, and that will make them very uncomfortable. You have to understand, withdrawals are from what I hear, unbearable, right? I mean, from any opioid, right? This isn't just fentanyl exclusive, because when you're withdrawing from it, you have to understand that the nerves, right, that loss of pain, you get so used to it. It's not just the dopamine, right? It's not just the dopamine, the euphoria that you have to overcome the addiction on that end. It becomes excruciatingly painful because your neurons are used to not sending painful signals. And now all of a sudden, when there's no opioids to tell them not to send signals, any sensitization of those neurons, even if it's not painful. Think about this, right? If you're so used to not feeling pain, when that fully comes online, your shirt itself can become painful because the neurons are just not used to processing that pain. It makes withdrawal symptoms excruciating. And so someone who actually will take naloxone or Narcan can actually kick right into one of those withdrawals. It is absolutely awful. In fact, everything about it is absolutely awful. Opioids are one of those things that, I am just deathly afraid of. And I tell everyone that I come into contact with who's going into the hospital, it's like, if you're going to be taking any kind of opioid, you need to be very careful with that, right? I remember when I was in the hospital for some of my gut issues, and they were telling me, hey, we're going to be giving you this and that. I was very resistant to taking any opioid in any capacity, and it's because I'm afraid of them. It's not to say that they can't be beneficial. I know they can. It's just I literally live in fear because I know what it can do to even the best of and most well-intentioned of people. And that's what's so unfortunate and heartbreaking for me, seeing so many people out there. I'm a veteran and I have friends who have actually fallen victim, right, to opioid abuse, right? They have opioid use disorder, they have opioid dependence, right? I mean, living in North America, I don't know how you can drive on the freeway without seeing billboards just saying get help for your opioid addiction, right? It's such a horrifying problem that is happening. So my hope is that we can find a way out of this. And I'm not going to pretend as though I have a way out of it. I don't want you to think that the anatomy guy who's teaching you on YouTube has the solution to the opioid epidemic. I just am hoping that people can educate themselves on it to make better decisions about if they have an opioid coming up, maybe they have some kind of procedure or something, or maybe they can just at least better understand someone who has already fallen into this opioid trap, because it is absolutely horrifying and depressing.
First off, tell me a little bit about you and why you have written so many articles on the drug scene. What made you do that?
I am an investigative journalist. I live in St. Louis, and I had a friend die from fentanyl in 2010, back before I'd really even heard of the drug at all. And I was writing a lot about music at the time, and in the rave scene, I started hearing about all these deaths, and I found out that almost all the rave drugs that people were taking that they thought were ecstasy actually were laced with other drugs, had almost no ecstasy at all. And so I learned about all of these new adulterants. These were all synthetic drugs coming from China. And the most lethal of all of them was fentanyl. And I started kind of going down the rabbit hole and ended up going to China and the drug labs where they make fentanyl.
Yeah, I was reading your book, and then I went to one of your speeches at the college, and your book really took me away. It scared me because it's unbelievable. Can you tell me how you went about contacting the Chinese dealers, and were you afraid when you got there?
The first thing I did was I just Googled buy fentanyl in China, and I was surprised by how many different links popped up to all these different companies who are just selling it blatantly over the internet. Then I made a fake profile and asked questions about the prices and how it was shipped and all that. And eventually I said, well, if I'm going to come to China, could I meet with you in person? And some people said yes. And so I got on a plane to China, and I ended up going to Shanghai, where I went undercover inside of a lab making fentanyl analogs, which were different variations of fentanyl that were actually legal in China at the time. And they also made other drugs like K2 and spice. And then I went to Wuhan. This was before coronavirus, but I went inside of a chemical company that was making more fentanyl precursors, the ingredients for fentanyl, than any other company in the world. And I saw this kind of vast sales floor with thousands or almost 1,000 salespeople in this company. These are young people who were hired for their English, and they were sitting at computers and laptops on social media, just selling fentanyl precursors all day long. And I learned they were selling to the Mexican cartels. I learned that the Chinese government actually gave incentives, tax incentives, research and development grants to these companies. And it kind of blew my mind, all that this was happening. Was I scared? Yeah, I was very nervous about it, and my wife didn't really want me to go. But, these companies are not like the Mexican cartels. We often hear about the Mexican cartels decapitating people and, having this bloody warfare. But even though the Chinese drug labs do business with these cartels, they actually try to operate as quietly as possible. since a lot of these products they sell actually are legal in China, they don't want to sort of call attention to themselves, or, because the Chinese government can change the law at any time. And, they don't have guns. There are very few guns at all in China among the citizens. And so I was more afraid of the government, really, that I would be put in jail for misrepresenting myself in the visa process. So I didn't get a journalist visa because everyone told me I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted to do. Then I would get like a babysitter and wouldn't be able to go to these labs. So I went there under a tourist visa, and that was illegal, and I could have been thrown in jail for that. So I was sort of most worried about that. But ultimately, my real identity was never discovered, and it all worked out, and my findings became the subject of my book, Fentanyl.
Now, when you said all these people sell this fentanyl and other drugs, don't they feel that there's a problem with that?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of these salespeople before I went. We had like Skype chats that went for hours and hours, and I asked them, I got really into their personal lives and how they got into this business. And a lot of them, didn't know what fentanyl was. They said they didn't, and I believed them, because fentanyl is not a problem for users in China. Like, almost nobody is addicted there or abuses it. China has its own drug problems, but fentanyl itself is mostly a problem in the US and Canada. And so, plus the government has complete control over the media. And so they never even heard really about fentanyl and didn't even realize that these chemicals they were selling were used to make fentanyl. But, some of them had some sort of a suspicion. And when I told them what these chemicals were for, some of them really sounded like they had remorse, and but the CEO himself really had no remorse at all. And what his explanation was that, we don't know what people are using these chemicals for. It's not up to us. We just sell them, and they could be using it for anything. These chemicals have lots of uses. Now, that's not actually true. I spoke with experts who said that, no, the only reason you would buy these chemicals is to make fentanyl. But for the CEO, he said, well, it's legal in China, and so that's basically enough for me. Since I got back, the CEO, who he goes by Chuan Fat Yip in Cantonese, and Ye Xuan Fa in Mandarin is how I identify him in the book. But there's a $5 million reward placed for information leading to his capture, and an indictment from the US Department of Justice. And so, but it looks like he will probably not be captured, because China has not agreed to extradite him, and China has not even arrested him, because, like I said, what he's doing is legal in China. And so the only way he could probably be captured in the US was if he got on a plane and came here, and he could be arrested when he got off the plane, or in one of our ally countries. But since he knows about this indictment, he's almost certainly not going to, be dumb enough to do that.
Do you think your investigation into this information brought that to the government, that's why they pushed for the, sorry, I'm having trouble talking today, pushed for the, do you think your investigation had a big part in that?
Yeah, well, they told me that my investigation helped a lot. Their original indictment was actually from 2018 and was just unsealed about a year ago. But so it's kind of an ongoing case, and I have spoken with federal officials about him a lot, actually. And there's now a case against his daughter, and this CEO, he's getting older, he's in his 70s, and he appears to be trying to pass down the family business to his daughter, who's in her 20s. And she, until recently, her LinkedIn page said that she was the managing director at some of these shell companies for this Wuhan chemical company selling all the fentanyl ingredients. But there was a Bitcoin wallet that was seized by the U.S. government, worth $2.3 million that they believe was taken from these fentanyl proceeds. And since then, his daughter has kind of scrubbed her LinkedIn page, and now she says that she's an actress and a model, and she does this jewelry business. She's actually on Instagram and has a ton of followers. She's kind of an influencer, which is just crazy to think about. You know, someone who's selling the ingredients that are causing this huge drug epidemic here in the US is kind of like going wild with a public persona in China.
Now, in your book, you kind of had a timeline of the fentanyl. Can you give us a quick timeline on the fentanyl menace from the beginning to now?
Well, fentanyl was invented in 1959 by a Belgian chemist, and it was originally developed as an alternative to morphine. And it was, you know, to this day, fentanyl remains a really important hospital drug. And what makes it so effective is it comes on so quickly, and it wears off quickly as well. So you can, you know, patients don't have to lie around for so long, and it kind of revolutionized procedures like it wasn't until really about 6 or 7 years ago that fentanyl completely jumped into the recreational realm and started causing this huge damage. For a long time, nobody was really afraid of that happening. Even the DEA in 2015 in their report said basically that fentanyl was not going to be a problem because it was just too powerful and users would fear overdose death. But then the very next year, it already surpassed prescription pills and heroin to become basically the worst drug menace in American history. And of course, the problem now is that fentanyl had been mainly an adulterant. So like most people didn't want it, and they got it when they used heroin or cocaine, meth, or prescription pills, all these fake pills that look just like an Adderall or a Xanax or a Percocet, except it's cut with fentanyl. And that's killed, you know, countless people. But now people are actually starting to request fentanyl by name. And it's gotten to the point where a lot of addicted users they don't want heroin anymore. And fentanyl is so much more powerful. It's about 50 times stronger. That, you know, whereas before with heroin, people just sort of stave off dope sickness. And now with fentanyl, they can get high again. And, you know, a lot of people say that once you go to fentanyl, there's really no going back to other drugs.
Wow, that's really scary. Reading your book, I see you have talked with the DEA a lot. Have they listened to a lot of your input?
Well, I mean, I think they found some of what I had to say helpful. I mean, I'm critical of the DEA as well, though, because I think that we're spending so much money on drug interdiction, and it really doesn't seem like it's making much difference at all. You know, I spoke with a Border Patrol agent in San Diego area, which is kind of the biggest port of entry for drugs like fentanyl. And he estimated that less than 1% of drugs coming into the US are seized. And, you know, it's not just the DEA, but it's Customs and Border Patrol, Department of Homeland Security, you know, the CIA, even Bureau of Land Management, BLM, is involved with drugs interdiction worldwide, meaning they're trying to stop drugs from coming into this country. And, it's just billions and billions and billions of dollars. And it's just sort of not working at all. Some more some more kind of optimistic estimates say that we catch 10% of the drugs coming in here. But even if it's that, it's just not justifying this giant cost at all. And it's becoming less and less clear what the function is of these agencies because the death overdose rate is continuing to get higher and higher every year.
Yeah, I agree. I know Americans are facing a deadly and growing public health crisis. And one of the people who wrote on the back of your book stated that the worst of which is to come. What do you think she meant by that?
Now we thought it was going to be like 107,000 drug deaths from 2021. They actually retallied the numbers and now it's like 110,000 or even more. Like I said, I think it's going to continue to get worse before it gets better, partly because people are asking for fentanyl by name. That's happening now in places like Vancouver, places like San Francisco. And I think it's going to not through the US, but Europe, Australia, all sorts, Mexico, all sorts of countries. Problem, but it's going to come. It's just the profit incentive is just too overwhelming for dealers to leave it alone. And I think users, if they have a choice, prefer these traditional plant-based drugs like heroin, marijuana, cocaine, these types of drugs. But synthetic versions are so cheap, they're so easy to make, and they're so profitable that they're starting to push out the plant-based drugs. And so, if we had something like a synthetic version of cocaine, for example, then that would be a complete game changer. And it's possible we could have something like that at some point. For the cartels who are now moving into places like Europe, it's just it's so much easier to smuggle. You can smuggle 1 pound of fentanyl, and that's the equivalent of smuggling 50 pounds of heroin. Wow. And again, this goes back to drug interdiction. And if we can't stop 50 pounds of heroin, which we can't, how are we going to stop 1 pound of fentanyl?
What do you think society itself could do what the DEA can't do? What can we do?
Well, that's the most important thing, I think, is sort of educating people and helping, people who aren't using these bad drugs like fentanyl, teaching them the truth about it, the reality, is step one. And, I do think there should be kind of a standardized federal program to educate people about these drugs, and not something like the DARE program, which kind of used a lot of fear mongering, but just a fact-based program. And the truth is scary enough in itself. The other thing that I think is really important is helping addicted users receive treatment. And so, only a small percentage of people who have opioid use disorder are actually in treatment. And, we're lucky because we have these good medicines to help people with opioid addictions. We have methadone, buprenorphine, and I think particularly underutilized is the treatment drug naltrexone, which is better known as the Vivitrol shot, and it actually blocks opioid receptors so that you could use heroin or fentanyl and it would have no effect on you. And this drug is only very about in the media at all. But we have these drugs at our disposal, yet people don't have access to them. And so I think this sort of two-pronged approach is the key, because we aren't going to stop these drugs from coming in. That's what I learned from all my trips to China. We can only sort of affect our own people here at home.
Mhm. Now, the fentanyl is a chemical based drug. And what I was reading in your book is they can change a bit of it to make it so it's legal in China, or legal. I guess I'm not explaining it well enough, but maybe you can.
Yeah, well, actually, China banned all forms of fentanyl in 2019 after I was there. So when I was there, yeah, exactly. They had this kind of cat and mouse game where they could just take the chemical structure of fentanyl and tweak it just a tiny bit to have a new chemical that acted just like fentanyl, but was technically legal. And so then when they banned that drug, they do the same thing. They just tweak it a little more. And again, you have something that's legal. But that's still going on in China with other drugs too. And so that's why even if we could get China to really do what we wanted to ban all these drugs, it still wouldn't make there's always the innovation is always one step ahead of the law.
Mhm.
And for example, after they banned all forms of fentanyl, we started seeing the rise of this opioid called ISO, and that started killing a lot of people in the US. And people said, well, why ISO? And the answer is because these Chinese chemical companies, these labs, the same ones that were making fentanyls before, now when that got banned, they actually follow the law, which is kind of funny when you think about a drug trafficking organization following the law, but they follow the law, and then they switch to making these other opioids, which are technically not fentanyls. And so they're totally legal. So, you can ban these and they'll move on to something else. The biggest problem right now is the fentanyl precursors, like I mentioned, which are shipped to Mexico, and the cartels make fentanyl out of that, and also things like different, most well known as Xanax and Valium. And so again, China has banned Xanax and Valium, but these companies just tweak the chemical formula, and now sending it to the US, and now we're seeing almost one of the top causes of death is people who are mixing these novel or analog benzos with fentanyl or with alcohol. And like a benzo, like a Xanax or a Valium, almost never kills anyone by themselves. But if you combine a Xanax or one of these novel benzos with alcohol, or if you combine it with fentanyl or heroin, that can kill you instantly because they're both downers. And we're seeing a lot of that now.
Wow. When they change the structure of the fentanyl or the other drugs, does it also make it more addictive?
Well, I don't know that necessarily more addictive, certainly. And one of the most famous fentanyl analogs is this carfentanil, which is like an elephant tranquilizer. Right. And when you think that fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, carfentanil is 100 times stronger than fentanyl. And so it's just the tiniest amount is enough to make people overdose.
Wow, that is just so. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Or any other, you said you do have a new book coming up besides the one you told me about? I have a book that was released recently, and it's called Little Brother, Love, Tragedy, and My Search for the Truth. It's about my mentee in the Big Brothers, Big Sisters program. Okay. And his name was Jarrell Cleveland. And we were together for 11 years here in St. Louis. He lived in Ferguson, Missouri, and until he was murdered in 2016. And after his death, the case went cold, and so police didn't have
couldn't find the killer. And so I applied my investigative reporting technique, my efforts into solving his murder and trying to get to the bottom of what really happened in his life.
Oh, let's see. I am out of questions.
Well, I can plug my website, which is benwesthoff.com.
That'd be great.
You just Google my name, Ben Westhoff, you'll find it. And you can also sign up for my newsletter there. I write about culture, drugs, and poverty. And my newsletter is called Drugs and Hip Hop. I actually published a couple books about hip hop, about the West Coast, gangster rap. Back in the day was one of them. And, I appreciate your having me on your program.
Well, I hope we can have you back again, hopefully one of these days live. That'd be great when you're back in the area. Fentanyl Inc. I don't know if you can really see the book, but I thank you again for being here today with me. And I look forward to reading other of your books.
Well, very cool. Thank you, Cris.
Thanks, Ben. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.